Hi, and welcome to the first video on science fiction linguistics here on YouTube. Today, I want to discuss a theory called linguistic relativism, also known as the Sapir-Whorf Hypothesis. The idea behind it is that the language we speak literally shapes our cognitive processes. On first glance, it seems like a reasonable assumption, right? Language gives us the structures to describe what's happening around us, so why shouldn't it affect the way we think about these things? It's a lot more complicated than that. So let's go back to the beginning. A German scientist named Franz Boas was a pioneer in the ethnography in the early 20th century. He believed that language and culture were inseparable and shaped each other. And unlike a lot of other people of his time, he believed that there was no such thing as a primitive language, and that no language, for example English, was superior to others, the pinnacle of linguistic evolution, etc. He was one of the first people to theorize about cultural relativism, which is the idea that the culture one lives in shapes one's values and that no culture is morally superior to another. You may not have heard of his student Alfred Kroeber, but you may know that name from his daughter, the Grandmaster of Science Fiction, Ursula Kroeber Le Guin. Another one of his students was Edward Sapir. Sapir believed that there is no such thing as direct equivalence and that direct translation was impossible because the societies that gave rise to these words are not the same and their experiences are inherently different. He theorized a very soft linguistic relativism, also known today as the weak Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. This is the idea that the words we use for things influence the way we think about and categorize various things. Sapir's thinking influenced the Russian philosopher-linguist Lev Vygotsky, who published Thought and Language in 1934, which described the ways he believed language affects children's cognitive development. Sapir also had students, and his most famous is Benjamin Lee Whorf of the hypothesis. He took Sapir's soft linguistic relativism and Boas's cultural relativism and came up with linguistic determinism. He believed that the language you speak determines the way you perceive things, and he set about trying to prove it. Or at least to write a lot of papers about it based on ideas we probably consider pretty problematic and exoticizing today. Whorf is the man who claimed that the Inuit have a lot of words for snow because it's so important in their daily experience. This has been shown to be false, yet it still crops up all the time. His main argument for this determinism was that Native American languages had semantic distinctions that European languages do not, making translations impossible. One example he used was that the Hopi had separate words for water in a drinking vessel and water in a lake, which European languages don't, unless we say water in a drinking vessel and water in a lake. These differences made the Hopi cognitively different from speakers of European languages, according to Mr. Whorf. But he had another really famous argument about the Hopi, and it was this. According to Whorf, the Hopi language lacked terms for distinct units of time, like hours or days, and they thought of time as more of a continuous process than discrete chunks like we see in European languages. This lack of words in their language influenced their cultural practices, according to Whorf. Except there's one problem. A linguist named Molotky tried to reproduce his research and found no evidence for Whorf's claims. And then, starting in the 60s, universal theoreticians like Noam Chomsky and Steven Pinker argued vociferously against this idea and wrote articles or even entire books arguing about why determinism is wrong. So when I went searching for articles about this subject to have a slightly more grounded argument against this hypothesis, I didn't find any that were published in linguistic journals. They were mainly published in psychology journals. Linguists apparently aren't really interested in the subject anymore because it's not exactly scientifically sound, And because formal linguistics, that is syntax, phonetics, phonology, morphology, is focused currently in the US on finding language universals. And relativity implies a lack of universals. Psychologists, especially cognitive psychologists, are still researching this. And their favorite way to do this is with color words. A 2007 study, and you can read this online, the link can be down in the description. A 2007 study suggested that Russian native speakers can distinguish between blues faster than native English speakers in simple categorization tasks, because Russian has two words for blue, sinich and goluboy. Sinich is dark blue, goluboy is lighter blue. It didn't affect the way either group categorized the colors, and they even drew the line between light and dark in right about the same place. The only difference is that Russian speakers are obligated to habitually distinguish the shades, so that when a Russian sees a blue shirt or a blue glass cup, they will have to determine in a split second whether they're going to say dark blue or light blue, referring to that object. And having to do that on a regular basis makes you have to distinguish that faster. But the fact that Russian speakers, this is a quote, the fact that Russian speakers show a category advantage across this color boundary suggests that language-specific categorical representations are normally brought online in perceptual decisions. What does that mean? When you talk about bringing something online in linguistics or psychology, it refers to the processes, the cognitive processes regarding language and thought. So further on in the paper, the authors say that the theory of linguistic relativism or determinism presupposes that language-related and non-language-related cognitive processes are entirely different in the human brain. They suggest that instead of asking this, we should ask to what extent language-related processes are involved when we perform non-language-related tasks, such as deciding whether the cup is light blue or dark blue. And they say that these, quote, linguistic representations normally meddle in even surprisingly simple objective perceptual decisions. And there's a full quote here, you can read that. So is this a game-winning shot for the Whorfianism? Not quite. As the authors say above, the linguistic and non-linguistic processes are linked together in human cognition, and the linguistic processes seem to influence some non-linguistic ones in ways that we don't really have an explanation for yet. This is, you might remember, the weak version of the hypothesis, where language influences the way you think. And this version is more plausible in my opinion, but the change I would make to these authors' conclusion is we should add society and culture as well to the things that shape the way we think about things. Because the cultural practices of the societies we grow up in influence the way we think about things, right? And influences the things we think about. I don't think most people would argue with that statement, right? But where Boas and Whorf's ideas come in, you can't have thinking without language. And thus, language shapes, determines the way you think, your cognitive processes. I don't agree with that. Culture influences language, absolutely. And maybe language has some effect on conceptions, the way you think about things. But it's all tangled together like really cheap yarn that just in this horrible knotted mess in the bottom of your knitting bag. And honestly, I don't know if we'll ever be able to thoroughly untangle this mess, because you can't raise a person outside of society, at least not ethically. And even if you have a couple of off-the-grid hippies raising their kids on a farm in the middle of Montana, they'll be influenced by their parents' culture and beliefs, right? Because their parents are teaching them how to live, how to be humans, how to be people in society, or outside of society. So, now that we've talked a little bit about what the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis is, next time we'll talk about some ways this idea has been used in speculative fiction, successfully and less successfully. So, if you like this video, click the like and subscribe buttons below and check out my Patreon.